think we will slowly get started. My name is Julie McBrien. I'm the Vice Director of the Amsterdam Research Center for Gender and Sexuality. Sarah Braca, who's here with us, is our director, and Diego, who's hiding behind, there he is, is our assistant. And we all want to welcome you today for our webinar in the Focus on Research series. Before I introduce our speaker and our discussant, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about our research center in case you're unfamiliar with it. ArcGS is a research center that brings together, fosters, and consolidates a community of scholars and scholarship on gender and sexuality within and beyond our faculty of social sciences. It's a community shaped by many differences in disciplinary contexts and traditions, different theoretical and epistemological approaches, different methodologies, and also differences in emphasis on gender or sexuality within the research. We are committed to making it an expansive community where such differences are welcomed and provide fertile ground for conversations and new ways of thinking. In addition to the Focus on Research lectures like we're having today, we have another parallel series called Thinking Through the Crisis. We'll be having an event next week, which will have both an online and offline presence. So for those of you in Amsterdam, we will be meeting, who can make it, we'll be meeting at Spouw 25. But we will also be streaming online, and you can find more information about that event on our website. Another great way to find out about all of our activities is via our newsletter. So if you haven't joined, please do. We are also active on all kinds of social media platforms that Diego facilitates for us. But we also have, of course, a number of other things that we are involved in. We have a vibrant PhD community that meets regularly to discuss their work on gender and sexuality. And we have a thesis prize. We have received a number of wonderful submissions this year. We're working through those, and we will look forward to announcing our winner early next year during one of our seminars. So that's a little bit about us, but more important than us today are our two guests. First, our speaker, Mohira Suyarkulova, is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek, and she actually joins us from Bishkek today. She's a self-confessed undisciplined scholar trained in international relations who has worked across disciplines on the intersection of academic research, activism, and artistic practice. She recently co-authored the book on happiness for young and not so young, LGBT, but not only people, with her colleagues and comrades Georgi Mamedov and Nina Bagdasarova. She writes for academic and public audiences on issues relating to gender, sexuality, and decoloniality. One of my favorite being her article on translating queer into Kyrgyzstani Russian, but also her contributions on open democracy, especially the piece on renegade research. I'm delighted to have Mohira here. Excuse me for that noise. But I'm also delighted to have our discussant here to join us. Rahil Rodzas is the assistant professor in the interdisciplinary social sciences and also at the anthropology department at the University of Amsterdam. And she holds an NWO Vinnie grant titled The Paradox of Romantic Love, Negotiating Autonomy and Commitment in Intimate Relationships in the Netherlands. Like Mohira, she too works on issues related to gender and sexuality. So they will be our team today. And Mohira will be giving us a talk called Feminine Happiness, Sexuality and Disability in Kyrgyzstan. So with that, Mohira, I turn over the stage to you.
Thank you very much, Julie, Sarah, Diego, and Rahil, and all the audience members whom unfortunately I cannot see. It's a great honor to be invited, and hopefully we'll be able to have an interesting discussion after. So I have some slides I want to share with you. So hopefully everyone can see this and hear me well enough. As already was said, this is me, Mohira Suyarkulova. I work at the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and this is my email that you can reach me through if you need to. But just to kind of give you some background also of some of the work that I do around gender, sexuality, and disability. Um, so I teach at university. That's kind of my main employment. Um, I teach courses on happiness and on sexuality, and also some courses on critical theory and courses on graduate writing and research methods. But also, I'm involved in Kyrgyzstan in feminist and LGBTQ plus um, activism, and I am a queer woman myself. So I'm going to be mentioning some of the projects that I've been involved in that kind of shaped my thinking about this subject. So um, I was involved for a few years in the work of an artistic collective, an institution called School of Theory and Activism Bishkek, or STAB. And one of the things that I was very excited and still very proud of is this collection of short feminist and queer science fiction stories that was edited by Oksana Shatalova and Georgy Mamedov, and it came out in 2018 in Russian. And if you read Russian, then you can find the full book, the whole PDF online for free through academia.edu. And I wrote a short story for this book, but I also translated a story. So this is also something that I do. I do translation work as kind of as part of my activism. So a story by an American queer disabled activist, Mia Mingus, was translated into Russian for this collection. So it's kind of, yeah, imagines a world where disabled people were exiled or onto another planet and left to die, but they not only survived, but they flourished and they created a community of mutual support there. And the illustration for that story kind of became also the cover of the whole book. So you can see right here, this is the illustration by Tatarstan-based queer artist Hagra. And another recent translation that I did that relates to the matter of disability is the text by Joanna Hedva called Sick Woman Theory. So this also kind of happened during the pandemic, during the lockdown in the summer of 2020, when the pandemic was like at its height in Kyrgyzstan, and it's been called the Black July here. And so I was thinking about, being sick and what it means for activism. And this text was, very important for me to translate. And it has been published in a zine called Transnational Feminisms. And finally, most recently, this is the book that I co-authored that has been mentioned in the introduction. So my co-authors are Nina Bakhtasarova and Georgy Mamedov, and together we wrote this book. It's also in Russian. It's based also on many years of ethnographic research that we've done either together or separately in different combinations on various what are called vulnerable groups in Kyrgyzstan. And yeah, so it's targeting LGBT communities, but it's really for everyone, right? So we take this kind of universalizing view here, and uh, basically um, look at happiness from feminist, queer, and left-wing perspective. Um, so this is kind of the longish introduction um, about how I came to think about these topics, the relationship between happiness, disability, and sexuality. So happiness, as we know, um, has become compulsory in the modern age, and a lot of knowledge is being produced about, you know, telling us, giving us some recipes about how to achieve it. And if you go to any bookstore, you will see, you know, shelves and shelves of self-help books that profess to finally, you know, discover the secret for happiness. Um, but you know, critical scholars of affect have long said that this ideology of personal happiness and the industry that has been created around it um, is actually about concealing the misery that we are steeped in, and basically it's about uh, displacing. It's about placing responsibility on individuals rather than on the, you know, the environment that we live in, the societies that we are part of. So uh, this idea um, is described as harmful by the critics of this ideology and ideology of happiness and happiness industry. Um, but yeah, like the way it works is that people often see that you know, happiness is the product of a good life, right? So it's often attached to specific this idea of happiness is attached to certain normative institutions such as marriage or objects that basically acquire this almost magical power that, you know, by having proximity to these institutions and objects, we hope to attain happiness. Um, so this attribution of happiness is also how norms and ideals become effective. So basically, the closer you can be um, to these norms and ideals, the more, the happier you're expected to become. And if you fail to achieve this promised happiness, then uh, it is seen that like it's your fault and it's your personal failure rather than a systemic issue. So these ideas are not innocent, of course, right? And um, we unconsciously hold or consciously, yeah, articulate all kinds of ideas about who is worthy and capable of being happy in the right way. So this is, by the way, also an illustration from our book on happiness by Alina Pichomkina, a Bishkek-based artist. So in the post-Soviet space, there is this very special conception of happiness for women, right? So we can translate it as feminine or woman's or womanly happiness. In Russian, it's женское счастье, and in other local languages, you would have some kind of translation of that idea, and it's very common and recognizable anywhere, you know, in the post-Soviet space. And when I was writing about it, I remembered this song that I heard so many times growing up as a girl in 1990s in post-Soviet Central Asia. It's performed by a pop singer Tatiana Ovsienko, and it's called exactly that, женское счастье, right? The feminine happiness. So how does she describe this idea in the song? It's an ideal heterosexual marriage, domestic bliss, where the woman feels protected by her husband. The husband, yeah, is there to be taken care of, and additionally, in everyday use, женское счастье also implies having children. So a woman's happiness is never complete without the experience of motherhood. And it's worthy to mention that женское счастье, so this feminine happiness, is conceptually distinct from simply happiness, right? So we don't have a corresponding idea of a manly or masculine happiness, because a man's happiness is simply happiness, right? So the masculine is supposedly universal. So женское счастье in this simple short phrase encapsulates several forms of normativity, right? So a compulsory sexuality, right? The requirement to be sexual, compulsory heterosexuality, compulsory motherhood or procreation, as well as compulsory able-bodiedness and compulsory happiness. And feminist scholars, of course, ever since the second wave, and perhaps even earlier, Betsy Friedan famously wrote the feminine mystique in the 1960s and started the second wave. In the United States, feminism, and this was the critique basically of this idea of domestic bliss that failed to materialize for what was the privileged, right, group of white, educated, middle class women in this developed country who were expected to be happy and be content with what they had, to find their feminine happiness at home, but they were not happy. And Sarah Ahmed also talks about so-called affect aliens, right? So affect aliens are what she calls willful subjects who are alienated from the proper effect of happiness, right? So they're out of line with affective community. So she, suggests these characters of the feminist killjoy, the melancholic migrant, the unhappy queer, and the raging revolutionaries. And I can also add to this list the figure of the sad creep, right? So people with disabilities are outside of the many normativities that supposedly lead to happiness. So what I'm going to talk about in more detail now is the result of two studies. So I led a participatory action study of sexual lives of LGBTQ plus people in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan in 2018. with the aim of creating a queer sex education curriculum to be taught through the LGBT organizations. And we developed this curriculum, and we had classes in the community center. And the other study was specifically focusing on disabled people and sexuality, also in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And there I mostly talked to people who are hard of hearing or deaf, and young women who have cerebral palsy. So this subject of sexuality of disabled people is rarely discussed in Kyrgyzstan. Partially, this is due to general lack of adequate language for talking about sexuality outside of the traditional patriarchal framing of sex as only related to reproduction, and disabled people are excluded from this a lot of times. So queer people and the disabled people both are often denied sexual subjectivity because they're not seen as full, mature, rational adults. And disabled people are either imagined as completely asexual, or they are hypersexualized. And especially women with disabilities are often denied reproductive choices, and their sexualities are invisible and stigmatized. And yeah, the issue of consent gains special salience in the context of disability, while sexual desire and practice are often talked about in this overly biologized and medicalized terms. So in my conversations with people with disability, I found that, of course, like many other people in Kyrgyzstan, they had no formal sex education. To begin with, people with disability often have difficulty accessing education in general. And out of among my respondents, none had higher education. Some had school level education, or some kind of specialized education that trained them in a vocation like seamstress, or doing some kind of trade. So I in my article that was published in Cole, it's a journal on gender that's published in Lebanon, and there I discuss how this can be considered a form of hermeneutical injustice. Yeah, that when people are denied access to knowledge, it's a type of socially constructed ignorance that is deliberate, which basically denies people self-knowledge and prevents politicization of their identity. So one of the notable things that came up in the interviews were the burden of virginity, when my respondents who identified as cisgender women were very much concerned with the matter of virginity and sexual reputation, and that's something that they share with non-disabled women in Kyrgyzstan. And my colleague Yelena Kim published last year an article about virginity rituals in Kyrgyzstan, which describe these practices very well. So I refer you to that. So in this conversation that I had with my interlocutors, they were very curious about this virginity and where is it located and how do they make sure that they perform their virginity properly. And the other thing that came up was this idea of having a child for oneself. So this is also something that is usually recommended to women who are considered as like less desirable partners for marriage, or who fail to get married at the proper age. So then, of course, it's not desirable to have children out of wedlock, but still, if you can't have it properly, then you should have a child just for oneself, right? So this compulsory motherhood or procreation is at work here. That like, okay, if you fail at being a desirable woman, then at least you can perform motherhood. And the other thing that came up time and time again was this concern about performing the role of Kilin. So daughter-in-law is the position that it's a role that a woman enters when she gets married, which requires a lot of physical back-breaking reproductive labor. So she's basically at the service of her husband's family until a younger kidney comes into the family, and then she is relieved of some of the burden. But if she is the youngest, then she basically is expected to shoulder most of this work. So even able-bodied women struggle to perform this role of a good killing, and for women with cerebral palsy, this was something that they cited as like one of the reasons why they they're scared, and they use this a lot, this phrase that they're scared, they're afraid of not only sexual activity itself, the sexual acts, but also of performing this labor that is expected, that goes along with the role of killing. So yeah, so this is a quote from one of the respondents. So when I asked him, like, did you have any formal sex education growing up? So this is his response. He says, no, of course none. We only had like classical poetry in our libraries, and nothing of that kind. So basically, and that is also a very common response in this research we did on sex lives of LGBTQ people. A lot of people said that they had no formal sex ed or very limited sex ed, and basically all their information about sex was gained from watching pornography. Excuse me. And another thing that became apparent from this study is the a lot of young people in general in Kyrgyzstan struggle with, maintaining autonomy from their parental families. So a lot of young people are financially and otherwise dependent on their parents, but this is especially true for disabled people. So this also affects, of course, your intimate relationships. So in this case, my respondent Begim is saying how she can't have any privacy because the door to her room is always open. There is no way to lock it, and even if she expressed the need for privacy, that would give rise to suspicions. And so we can see in a lot of these stories. So, like for instance, a lot of women reported um, a lot of instances of sexual harassment and assault and unwanted advances from even strangers, but also family members. Um, so, in a way, being disabled doesn't necessarily excuse you from this compulsory uh, sexuality scripts. Uh, but in some cases, it can be also experienced as liberating. So in this case, Mir, who is a trans man, uh, uh, describes his experience with growing up with no hand. So he was born with no hand, and he has a heart condition. And he, from very early age, didn't want to, dress in skirts and dresses. Um, and basically, he found a way to explain his reluctance to uh, dress in a feminine way uh, with his disability. So he would tell his mom and others that skirts and dresses don't have pockets, and he needs pockets to hide his hand. So in a way, he's quite grateful for having this, kind of escape or a way out of this um, compulsory cisgenderness, or we can call it. So yeah, this normativity. Um, Another thing, so happiness is usually home and family are considered the places where one finds happiness. So these are kind of fortresses um, of love in the cruel world, but not so much for many queer and disabled people. Um, so again, in my research, I found that for many people, home is not necessarily a safe place, and there's a lot of abuse and kind of pressure and unhappiness that is associated with being in contact with relatives. So in this case, Noor, who is a hard of hearing cis woman, describes how her when she got married, uh, her mother-in-law basically took advantage of her. She demanded to basically have full use of the earnings that she was making, and also was expecting her to be the full-time Kilin, to to do a lot of also work, like working her day job during the week, then on the weekends to come to her house in the um, village and tend to the cow and do all kinds of other manual labor. And she didn't ease up even after she gave birth to her child. So like the final straw for her was when uh, the mother-in-law suggested that um, her so Noor's sister-in-law, the mother-in-law's daughter, would breastfeed Noor's child, and she was greatly offended when Noor refused, so she was put out of the house. And Noor also told me the story of her close friend who, shortly before our conversation, uh, committed suicide. So she basically burned herself and her two children uh, in their in the shed that they were staying, because um, her mother-in-law basically kind of defrauded her and her husband out of the money that the state gave them um, to buy land to build their own house. So basically, she took away that money and promised them that they can stay with her at her house, but then she also put them out of the house and they had to stay in an unheated shed in winter. So in desperation, she basically committed suicide. So these kind of stories, unfortunately, are quite common. So relatives often have a lot of influence. For instance, in some cases, people told me that, like, my mother forbid me from getting married to this or that person because of their ethnicity or for some other reason. So family oftentimes is not a safe and a happy place. And so uh, people that I talked to oftentimes when they were describing happiness and happy moments, they were not talking about this vision of feminine happiness, or kind of happiness that is found in this type of compulsory heterosexuality. Uh, they talked about doing something creative or engaging in sports or feeling like they're part of a community. So yeah, so basically they had other visions of happiness. So this is a picture from the 8th of March, so Women's Day March this year. So I'm on the organizing committee of the march, and this year we also wanted to politicize this idea of women's happiness. So the banner that the um, the women are carrying in the front reads women's happiness or feminine happiness is freedom of peaceful assembly. And it's kind of we had other also slogans that tried to redefine what it means uh, uh, for women to be happy, because Women's Day in former Soviet countries has over the years, it's been turned into the opposite of its initial intentions, right? So it's a political holiday that was created by socialist women who were demanding, bread and peace, and nowadays it's been turned into this um, basically holiday, like a celebration of femininity, right? And it's exactly on this day that women get this kind of congratulations and wishes for feminine happiness, right? Um, so in our protests, we were saying that we want to redefine what it means for women to be happy. In the previous year, the Women's March was attacked by unknown men who were wearing masks. And the police, instead of arresting the attackers, arrested the women who came out to celebrate Women's Day. We spent 3 hours in the police department that year, and this year again, the authorities tried to ban the march, but we came out anyway. This year they decided not to attack us. But who knows what's going to come in the future. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohira, for a wonderful, rich discussion and beautiful slides, if I might say. I'm going to give the floor immediately to Rahil, who is your discussant today, to let her share her thoughts and questions. Rahil?
Yes, thank you, Julie. And thank you, Mohira, for this indeed very rich talk and very fascinating, very interesting, with beautiful images, I agree. And also thank you for the important work that you do as a scholar, as an activist. It's very inspiring. So I thought I'll just start with asking a question about the culture of happiness in Kyrgyzstan, more generally. As you mentioned, the feminist scholarship that you mentioned in your talk about happiness mainly focuses on late capitalist neoliberal societies, right? And I was wondering to what extent that critique is useful for you in the context of Kyrgyzstan, to what extent it applies to that context. And I was also thinking about the Netherlands, the context where I do my research, and where also happiness, the imperative of happiness plays an important role in the research that I do on the polyamory community, where it is also about how happiness has become an object of consumption, and also sort of applies to a very large population through informal therapy, through popular psychology, as you mentioned, like self-help books, podcasts, and other kind of media. So I was wondering about the culture of happiness in the context where you do your research. And you, of course, mentioned the concept of feminine happiness, or the womanly happiness. But you also mentioned in a side note something about men's happiness as sort of the assumed as the universal. So can you say a bit more about the culture of happiness beyond that concept of feminine or the womanly happiness in Kyrgyzstan? I hope my question is clear.
Yes, thank you. So indeed, Kyrgyzstan is part of the globalized economy and has been since the 90s, right? And Kyrgyz people have been exposed to a lot of these capitalist ideas about happiness, and on every street corner you can find like these counterfeit copies of books that promise to teach you how to be rich, how to be successful. So this has very much permeated and the popular psychology ideas are also kind of, it's just something in the air. It's in all the media that we consume here. In Kyrgyzstan, there's also this movement called the Jirghalism, So it's kind of about just hedonic um, um, enjoyment of life, right? So it also makes a direct kind of reference to um, Bhutan's uh, uh, project of increasing national happiness rather than increasing the gross national, rather than measuring the gross national product of the country, to instead make it the goal of the state to increase the happiness of its citizens. But it hasn't really gained much popularity. It's something quite on the margins. So I think yes, like people almost 1 million of Kyrgyzstanis live abroad, or they regularly travel abroad, mostly to Russia, as migrant workers. And Kyrgyzstan is one of the countries that has the highest share of remittances, as so the share of remittances in the GDP is quite large for Kyrgyzstan. So it's very important for the economy, this money. But there's also kind of part of this post-Soviet also narrative of finding happiness through immigration, for instance, right? So I remember very distinctly growing up and having this very clear kind of idea that in order to be successful and happy, one has to go abroad and like at all costs, try and stay there and build your life there. And this is a very also a strong normative idea for a lot of people, that like they realize that life in Kyrgyzstan doesn't meet these standards that they are told to aspire to, or even some basic needs, right, are not met. So the the logical then thing is to seek that elsewhere. So yeah, I think these theories that we've been referring to when doing our research, they do work, in Kyrgyz context as well, because we are all living in this neoliberal capitalist world that also, among other things, teaches us to feel a certain way and to aspire to certain things. But thanks for your question.
Yeah, thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question, Julie? Yes, okay. Yeah, thank you. I was perhaps a follow-up question on that. I was wondering about how you think on marginality, the position of marginality, and whether being excluded from these scripts of happiness and love, whether that's a bad thing, since being included in it, according at least to the scholars you mentioned, leads to misery and alienation. So even for in it, happiness inherently is seen as problematic in this scholarship, right? It's I'm talking about this idea that the ideal of happiness is in the end unreachable, unattainable. One has to work on themselves, improve, self-develop, but there's no clear end point. So you keep working on yourself, and indeed it's the individual's responsibility to do that. And not being able to reach that point, this ongoing process leads to misery. So is then being marginalized necessarily a problem? As I mean, it is a site of oppression, obviously, as you illustrated, but could it also be seen as maybe a place from where counter-hegemonic discourses could develop?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's exactly what I'm trying to say, and also what we say in our book on happiness. So we take this kind of universalizing approach that Sedgwick suggested, right? So it's in um, um, we basically are saying that um, there is power in this, that actually, the so-called normals, right, have a lot to learn from the marginalized people. So, um, sort of seeing this, you know, uh, queer art of failure, right? So this failure to adhere to the norm, it is actually not only the critique of the existing order, but it's also potentially an alternative to it. So yeah, so we um, talk about, for instance, this idea of chosen family. Um, yeah, that exists in queer culture. Uh, so alternatives, alternative ways to imagine uh, communities of care and mutual support and intimacy and love. um, so yeah, and instead of trying to imagine happiness as simply an individual project, we want to imagine happiness as a collective project. Um, so basically, this is kind of the main thesis, is that, yeah, happiness is about solidarity. Um, so in Russian, the word for happiness, счастье, it's usually like its etymology is explained as like something that happens to you, right? Like it's your lot in life, right? Участь, right? Like it comes from this root that um, uh, it's basically like destiny. But there is another way to read it, is to think of it as соучастие, so like uh, co-participation, or like being part of something larger than yourself. So yeah, that's how I understand it. Um,
So if I understand correctly, it's about redefining happiness, and not necessarily rejecting happiness as an ideal. Because you also mentioned killjoy and then sad crib. Is that like, I wasn't sure if that implies a rejection of happiness or not.
yeah, so we do want to appropriate this idea of happiness because it's a very strong idea, right? And it's very clear when we talk about like right-wing ideology or like libertarian ideology. It's very clear what the path to happiness is supposed to be, but for leftist ideology, there's always this critique of the existing order, and there is no kind of clear explanation of how to become happy, right? Because it's natural for people to want to be happy, and not in some imaginary kind of future. So basically, it's very important for us to understand that these seeds for future happiness, they are already here in our current lives, right? So we already have something valuable um, that we can build on, something that yeah, that should be recognized as yeah, as a kind of vision for how we can be happy differently.
Thank you. I think this is really interesting because it's, I'm thinking about the critical feminist perspective you discussed, and how from that perspective, the outcome of misery and alienation, how you're now suggesting, seem to suggest that perhaps a different outcome is possible. So I think that's a very interesting suggestion you're making. If I can use my privileges to ask another question, sorry, then I'll stop. Just about sex education, you mentioned in your talk. I wondered if you could say more about that in terms of, is it a need expressed by your interlocutors, and what would that sex education entail, and who would it address? Is it for were you talking about your interlocutors specifically, or would it be for the larger population and education on consent and harassment and etc.?
Yeah, so once again, like if we take this universalizing view of like queer and creep experiences, right? What meets the kind of needs and it kind of refers to the experiences of the most marginalized groups actually results in better sex education for everybody, right? So just like, you know, for instance, creating accessible environment benefits everybody, right? It just makes for a more pleasurable and comfortable experience, right? If you have like accessible transport and walkways and buildings, it's just nicer for everybody. And the same way with sex education, right? If we create sex education that, for instance, is not based on the heteronormative idea of like that proper normal sex is, you know, only you know, this kind of penetrative penis and vagina sex between heterosexual partners, and you know that it ends when, you know, the person with the penis reaches orgasm, and and you know, if we focus on all these other important things, then it actually, yeah, results in better sex education for everybody. Yes, and I read recently with my students this article called, and it has many authors, but one of the authors is Van Anders, who came up with this idea of sexual configuration theory, and I really like that like she talks about like sexuality not in terms of orientation but configuration. So, you know, everybody has a unique configuration of sexuality. I find that very useful. But this article I'm talking about, it's called something like the heteronormativity theory of low sexual desire in women partnered with men, right? So, so basically, the main argument they're making there is that it's heteronormativity. It's all these norms around sexuality that result in, you know, the orgasm gap. Basically, you know, heterosexual cis women have the least number of orgasms in sexual encounters with men, and that is the result of this kind of normativity about what is considered proper and normal sex. Also, the reproductive labor burden on women, where they are just, you know, simply exhausted, and and also they then start relating to their partner more like a mother, right? So the dynamic in the relationship becomes more like one between a mother and a child. So, you know, so they kind of break it down into all of these things. So basically, you know, heteronormativity doesn't even work for heterosexual people. So it doesn't work for anybody. Yeah, so if we deconstruct it and create sex education that is not like that, then it helps everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. I'm just going to take 1 minute to reflect as well before I open up the question to the audience. And so if anybody out there has any questions, you can already start putting them in the Q&A box, typing them in, and then we'll take the questions in a few minutes. I don't have a real probing question for you because Rahil already asked the one that I was most interested in, which is this question of whether the demand to be happy was going to be met by a counter move that says, no, we exert the right to be unhappy, or whether it was, is there an alternative happiness? And you've answered that. And I really liked, of all the articulations you put out there about sports or creative work or community, the one about freedom of assembly. That was, I thought that was a nice one. But on this last part, I think probably some of the audience members don't know, I do research in Kyrgyzstan as well. And this part about heteronormativity also not working for those who are in heterosexual relationships. I've been doing research the last several years on marriage among cisgendered women in heterosexual relationships. And I remember giving a talk at the university where Mohira works with a bunch of cisgendered women, students there. And I basically was relating to them the kind of unhappiness that my interlocutors had in marriage. And the person who was chairing our session turned and said, well, are any women in Kyrgyzstan happy? Was the comment. And I thought a minute, he said, tell me, Julie, out of your research, who's happy? And I said, well, actually, of all the women I've spoke to, the divorced women are the happiest. And then we all paused, and the female students and I looked at each other, and I said, oh, but only the ones with children. They're you know, that's, and even then, even if they broke out of at least the idea of having to be married, they couldn't quite break out of the idea of needing to have children. So that really resonated for me with some of the things that you were saying. And I want to thank you also for the kind of ground you're breaking in revealing a lot of the life worlds and experiences of people who are often not covered in the research in Central Asia by looking at, for example, the sexual desires of people in general, but specifically of the disabled, the queer, and treating that not only in its political context, but also just the pure sexual desire of it, which I think is really great. And maybe I'll leave you with this. You can comment on anything you want, but the thing that I have a little circle around on my paper, I loved this idea you had that the objects and the institutions around kind of this heteronormative ideal of happiness act as if they're magic, you know, that they have these magical powers, and the closer you come to it, you know, apparently that would be the closest you could get to happiness. And I thought you could do amazing things. All kinds of images were popping to my head and metaphors, but this idea of the magic, and of course, you know, thinking of the scholars who you've talked about, the rather the falsehood of that magic, you know, the false promise it offers, was one of the concepts of yours that I really appreciated. So those are my thoughts. You can respond to them if you like, and then we can take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. So yes, indeed, that there are many studies that, unfortunately, not in Kyrgyzstan yet, that would like statistically measure happiness or like self-reported psychological well-being. They usually use it. The term is usually used, psychological well-being or life satisfaction surveys. They're used in creating this happiness indexes and stuff like that. So research in like developed countries shows that like one of the happiest demographics are actually unmarried women without children. And if we look at also kind of the age progression of happiness. It's again, like people in the reproductive age, right? So people tend to be happiest when they're young, and then it dips during the reproductive years, and then people become much happier in their old age. So basically, it's this, pressure of reproductive work and the lack of support, basically, and a lot of people are also have this. Sandwich, they're called sandwich generation, I think. People who have to both bring up their children while taking care of their elderly parents. So yeah, people may find this, meaningful and fulfilling, but it doesn't make them happier. So yeah, like when but also at the same time, the other side of this coin is that there's all this stigmatization of being single. And again, yeah, there are already several sociological studies that show that, contrary to the stereotypes and the stigma, single people are pretty happy despite the discrimination they face. Um, yeah, they're very good at maintaining friendships and social connections. They volunteer a lot. They engage in creative pursuits. They just are having better sex than married people and things like that. So yeah, so what you said about yeah, being being divorced maybe in Central Asia is this opportunity when you've kind of fulfilled this requirement, so you have been married, right? So you can tick that box, and also if you have children, then you've performed that part of your womanhood, then yeah, and then you don't have to have that extra burden of unhappy marriage. So I guess it would improve your life a lot. Sorry, maybe I'm rambling a little.
No, you're fine, but I see Sarah has a question. Sarah, do you want to come in and ask?
Yes. I actually do have one concrete question, but before I want to get there, I just want to comment how wonderful this was, and how for me something was really eye-opening here. And I'm just going to comment on it, and I think I'm going to repeat some of the things that Rahil and Julie said, but I need to repeat it before I get to my question. So when you said that, and I'm going to try to read from my notes, when you asked the question, who is worth and capable of being happy the right way, right? And that question for me, the radical potential of that question, that was eye-opening, because I know that a similar question in a similar way, right? Like we've been looking at a similar question in queer studies for a while now, if you want, which is Judith Butler's question and many others of, who can be grieved, right? So the grievable lives, and and it's, which is also about norms and dehumanization, right? So normativity and dehumanization, but which life is grievable and which life is not, and that's for many of us, I think, a familiar question that we've been, and that is also a radical question, right? Like the radical potential to rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. But now all of a sudden today, this question of like, yes, but who is worthy of happiness, like doing a similar move. And at the same time, I was trying to think this through. It feels like a similar move, but it's not symmetrical, because with the whose lives are grievable question, the forms of grief haven't been put on the forefront, right? Like, okay, the political agenda has been, there are ungrievable lives that we want to grieve, right? So we mourn, collectively, we put out candles, and we say the names of people, who have been killed, and their names are not even known, and so forth. So the forms of grief are familiar forms of grief, right? But with the question of who is worth and capable of being happy, what you've basically put out today is that we cannot go to the forms of happiness that we know to answer that question well. So in a sense, it's a more radical potential in that question. Okay, I needed to say this because I will be thinking about this for a while now, and I wanted to thank you for that eye-opening insight. My concrete question is, at some moments during your talk, I had to think of Lauren Berlant and her cruel optimism, right? And so can you speak a little bit to that, when we who don't fit the norms, who are marginalized, but when we deeply, deeply aspire to that form of happiness and the harm that aspiration does. Out of your research, what did you find something similar than what Lauren Berlant is describing in a different context? Or did that work differently? But really the aspiration to something that is harmful.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. It's definitely something that is really difficult to shake off. Like I see that also in my teaching. This kind of toxic positivity mandate, right? Um, uh, which is related to this belief in the just world, right? That basically things happen for a reason, or that good things happen to good people, or it's really difficult for people to shake off, despite the experiences they may have in their lives. So for instance, in my happiness course this semester, I have a lot of Afghan students who were evacuated from Kabul. And when we looked at some data, basically, this world map of the World Happiness Index, and Afghanistan is the least happy place in the world, right? And they reacted with this sort of not disbelief, but kind of a rejection of that idea, right? They said, many of them, that yes, we're living through horrible times, but we are not unhappy people. We're still cheerful people, and we are optimistic, and we believe in a better future. So I don't know, like on one hand, there is some dignity in that, that yes, of course, despite our lives maybe being difficult and challenging at times, right? So for instance, also queer existence often is described, especially like if you think in like Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan, oftentimes all the discussions about queer experiences are about like human rights violations, and torture and murder, and or disease. But this is not the entirety of our lives, right? So we we also have these rich experiences, and there is joyful moments, there is tenderness, there is care, there is dignity, all kinds of things that are precious, and they also need to be celebrated and remembered, and recognized. So I don't know, like it's a tough it's a tough question to consider, but definitely a lot of times it is an oppressive mechanism, isn't it? So I think it was Simone de Beauvoir who said that it's very hard to define what happiness is, yeah, but definitely happiness is, so it's very easy to describe as happy the position in which you want others to be, right? So, so and kind of to pathologize um, the um, the affect aliens, right? So we know that, for instance, unhappy women in Victorian period would be called hysterical, or the slaves, the enslaved people who escaped. There was a diagnosis for that, right? Like, so there was a psychiatric diagnosis that basically pathologized the desire of an enslaved person to escape the enslavement. So if we talk about this also language of psychiatry, oftentimes, yeah, as one of the mechanisms of domination, then we can see very clearly, right, how it works, like how people are expected to feel about the situations that the system places them in. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Okay, there are a few questions in the chat. We have 3. Mohira, would you rather take them one by one, or shall I read them all and then you take them as a group?
Maybe one by one,
Sure.
so I don't forget. Yeah.
No problem. Okay, the first one asks, it says, thank you very much for an inspiring paper. Listening to you, I was wondering whether you also struggled with particular terms in the context of Kyrgyzstan, such as LGTB+. For one, this global acronym endorses particular ideas of identity and the notion that one's sexual erotic desire defines who or what you are. In my research context, this is a bit too ethnocentric. The way people refer to their erotic lives or desires cannot quite be grasped by such terms. How is that in your research?
Yes, and another excellent question, and it is very true. And again, my colleagues and comrades, Nina and Georgi, have just published a paper in a French journal, but the article is in Russian. And this was, again, done deliberately so that the research is accessible to Russian-speaking queer people here in Central Asia. And the title of their paper is Tema a не LGBT. So it's basically Tema not LGBT, right? So they're discussing the terminology, and Tema is basically the term that is used in the post-Soviet space by queer people to describe themselves, right? So in everyday use, people don't usually say LGBT, although it's become more common now, or even queer, right? The Russian equivalent of queer. So Tema means literally a theme, but to be in the theme or in the know, right? So it means to be in the know. It's basically sort of a language, like it's a code word. So in a way, it's kind of language of the closet, we could say. So that's why in the activist sphere, people see it as a kind of backwards and inappropriate. So they use the more politicized term of LGBTQ. But yeah, the queer people, themselves usually use that. And it's not just about kind of staying hidden, it's also very much about creating a community, right? So basically, this original meaning of coming out, right, in English was also not about coming out of the closet, yeah, for the benefit. Like, it's not about making that confession for the benefit of the heterosexual society, It's about coming out, sort of like a debutante would, sort of, coming out to the community, joining a community, becoming part of a community. So to uh, to uh, my friends who wrote this article, tema is potentially something that we can recognize as, the local and valid way of talking about queer experiences. And of course, this, also conversation about other terms that exist in other Central Asian languages, not just Russian, is ongoing. Yeah, so a lot of these terms have stigmatizing connotations now, um, and they haven't yet been kind of reappropriated by queer people themselves. So it's an ongoing process with this new language to talk about it.
Okay, well, there are two more, so I will give you the next one, which says, this is a very, very interesting lecture. Thank you. You briefly mentioned something about decolonization, and I was wondering whether you can elaborate on this, speaking from a post-Soviet context.
I think I didn't mention it, but Julie mentioned it in her introduction.
It's my fault.
Yeah, it's kind of become the new hot topic in Central Asian studies. Everyone is talking about it these days. And yeah, to me, it's kind of also important to not just kind of use it in an unthinking way, right? Because it also comes from a specific context. And yeah, so what does decolonization mean in the context of Central Asia? People are still debating if Soviet experience can be described as colonial, and maybe we can, yeah, continue those debates, but definitely, Soviet experience had characteristics of coloniality, although maybe it's not reducible entirely, to that. And but definitely the period that we are living through now can be described as colonial or neo-colonial, right? So who are the agents of this, colonization or imperialism, and what would, decolonization mean in political terms, in practical terms, to, like, reparations need to be paid, and to whom and by whom, and and to me it's also very important to not also then be alienated from our socialist past and heritage, because to me, as a Marxist, it's very important that, even though the Soviet experience was deeply flawed, it is the only experience of socialism in the region that we have. And for instance, when people reject certain heritage just because it's associated with that period of history, they're also, in a way, kind of refusing agency of our grandparents and parents, right? In a way, then we are saying that people could not be, Central Asian and communist, for instance, right? That it's impossible. So either people were insincere, or they were duped, which I think is also not true, right? So people were sincerely communists. They believed in communism, and they participated in creating the societies that, including, for instance, infrastructure, right? So it's not that some aliens came here to build, our cities, for instance. It was our grandparents' labor that created them. So just to say that, oh, it's not part of our culture, it's not part of our heritage, is also a bit strange. And the same kind of, so my point is that we should kind of claim that heritage and that past as well, that like it's not some white people who handed us down this what is considered like civilization, right? Central Asians actively participated in creation of this new society on different terms, yeah. And yeah, it's very difficult, and it's always a very emotional kind of discussion, right? Because oftentimes when we search for this authenticity in some kind of distant past that we don't have direct connection to, yeah, basically the result is that people just feel bad about themselves. And I think we should embrace this kind of hybridity and this kind of experience of the borderlands and yeah, the complexity of it all, and not try to look for simple answers to complex questions. So I don't know if that again addresses the the question that was being asked.
Well, I think we'll keep it there because we're out of time, but I'll give you the last question, and maybe you can just take 1 minute to answer it or to address it briefly, although it's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you relate this work to what is going on politically? Will political action need to take place in order to shift the happiness agenda?
Mm-hmm.
1 minute.
Yeah. Yes, it's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, I think it's about so the point of our research, my specific study that I presented in our collective work with Georgi and Nina, was to empower people to have this kind of sociological imagination, right? So, and in the definition of sociological imagination, it says something like it's a terrible understanding, but it's also a wonderful understanding, right? So when you understand that your individual life and destiny is connected to history and lives and destinies of other people in the society, it's a terrible realization, because you realize that you're maybe not so unique. But it's a wonderful realization, because then you understand that you're not alone, and that the power comes from collective action, right? So, our purpose was to basically empower readers to understand that, and then to engage in this collective action. So I don't know if again, I've managed to answer this very large and important question.
I think you did a beautiful job, given the fact that I only gave you 1 minute. So Mohira, I want to thank you for being here, for giving this wonderful talk, for engaging in conversation with me, Rahil, with all of our guests. And I want to thank all of the people who've come and attended this webinar. And we wish you all a good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are in the world, and hope to see you back at our next ArcGIS event. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.